Everybody. It's a nice crowd again this week. Today's session, we're talking about the implications of climate change on food security. Previous talks have focused on the impact on health and well-being, as well as on population migration. But food security is intrinsically related both to health and well-being, as well as to migration. And it's going to be explored in depth today by our guest speaker. The world's complex food system is truly having a difficult time meeting the needs of the growing population of the world. It's estimated, according to what I found, and Walter, you could correct me, that the number of chronically hungry people around the world has grown substantially just over the past 3 years. In 2020, it's estimated that 821 million people, that's 1 in 9, are undernourished, and millions more in both the developed and developing countries are experiencing shortages of food every day. Over 1 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiency, which is sometimes referred to as hidden hunger. Climate change directly impacts food production through crop yield changes, and this is going to vary, of course, by geography around the world. Projected increases in temperature, in changes in precipitation patterns, changes in extreme weather events, reductions in water availability, individually and collectively increase the likelihood of reduced agricultural productivity. And some estimates show that global food production has to increase by 70% by 2050, which is not so far away, just to meet the needs of the population. So of all the impacts from climate change on agriculture and food, drought is probably the most harmful. And hopefully we're going to hear much more about that in the ensuing hour. Our speaker, Dr. Walter Basquin, is the Director of the Regional and Sectorial Research Program and leader for Latin America and the Caribbean in the International Research Institute for Climate and Society at the Earth Institute of Columbia University. His work focuses on establishing regional research and capacity building programs that aim to improve climate risk assessment and risk management in agriculture, health, water resources, and natural ecosystems. He received his BA in agricultural engineering from the Universidad de la República in Uruguay. His master's is MSc in Crop and Soil Environmental Sciences from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, and his PhD also in Crop and Soil Environmental Sciences from Virginia Polytech. He served as consultant to numerous public organizations, including the Inter-American Development Bank, USAID, and many UN agencies. So it is my pleasure to warmly welcome our guest speaker, who is coming to us live from Montevideo. Walter.
Hey, thank you very much, Madeline. It's a pleasure. I wish I was there, but hopefully next year we'll have live. Thank you very much for the invitation. And when I prepare these classes, the first thing that I think is that a lot of you guys that are attending these courses are going to be either informing policy making or actually elaborating policy. And so one of the main objectives of these classes is to discuss with you thinking of your future roles. So I really hope that we have time for a lot of questions and discussions. I'm going to leave, I don't have to do anything after this talk, so I'll leave my Zoom open. We can talk for as long as you want. And let me see, I'm going to try to share my screen and can you see my screen?
Yes.
It's full screen, it's on presentation mode.
Looks good.
Okay.
Looks great.
Okay, thanks. So This is the general area of the presentation. I'm going to turn my camera off just to be sure that I don't compete for the bandwidth. And so what is the challenge of food security? Madeline, in the introduction, mentioned a few. What is the challenge? The challenge is that we still have more than 800 million people undernourished in the world. And for the first time in the last 3 times, for the first time in a decade, that number increased. We have, I would say, an unacceptable number of children that are stunting, but those children that are stunting are coexisting with an increased number of overweight children. We have a big problem with overweight and obesity in the adult population of the world. And for the first time in history, the problems related to overweight and obesity, the health problems, are more numerous than the problems directly related to undernourishment. So this is becoming one of the most important public health problems in the world. In addition, also Madeline named this, we have an estimated 2 billion people with that suffer from a chronic deficiency of micronutrients, or what is called a hidden hunger. The reality is that we don't really know what is the situation with the micronutrient deficiencies, and this is something that needs to be studied more carefully. And when we study the impacts of climate change, climate variability on food security, we use the approach of food systems. And by definition, food systems include multi-dimensions, right? So you have the value chain, the typical value chain from the input supply to the agriculture production, storage, processing, and so on. And some of these elements of the food systems are sensitive to climate and some are not. And so one of the main challenges that we confront when studying food security and food systems is building the right multidisciplinary tools, which is not always easy. It's especially important to build multidisciplinary teams when studying food insecurity because of the nature of the problem. And this is just an example of connecting 2 ongoing challenges for humanity: conflict and food insecurity. And what this is showing is that the number of children affected by undernourishment is much larger in countries that are affected by conflict. So when we try to approach the food security problem at global scale, we need to study all these different disciplines and the interaction between the different sectors. And this is what creates a big challenge. It's a wonderful challenge for research, but it's a pretty, it can be a very difficult challenge to approach. Now, the Global Nutrition Report identified 5 critical steps to achieve progress in food security at global level, and they're mentioned here. What I will do in this presentation is I will focus mainly in breaking down the silos, which is a big problem, especially in the research community. And a lot of the talk will have to do with the data. What is the data that we need when we are connecting food security and climate change? And this is, I think it's especially important to dedicate time to this because climate change, as you know, it has become, I would say, a very popular issue, an issue that has received and is receiving and hopefully will receive in the global community a lot of support for work. And what I hope that you get as a message from this talk is that a lot of the work, a lot of the way, a lot of the approaches have been used in climate change are probably not very effective for connecting with food security, but for connecting in general to development efforts. And let me tell you why. So first of all, just to be sure that we are in the same page, when we talk about climate change, we need to talk about greenhouse effect. And this is a greenhouse effect in a greenhouse. So we have the solar radiation coming into the greenhouse. There is a part of that is absorbed by the soil and is re-emitted as heat, as infrared. And when it's going to leave the greenhouse, it reaches the glass and some of that heat goes back into the greenhouse. And this is why inside of the greenhouse, the temperature is higher than outside of the greenhouse. This is the greenhouse effect in a greenhouse. In the Earth, in the planet, something very similar happens. You have solar radiation coming in, and then some of the heat is re-emitted from the surface of the planet. And when it's going to escape, some escapes out of the atmosphere, but some is trapped by the equivalent to the roof, to the glass roof of a greenhouse. In this case, it's gases present in the atmosphere that have the property of being able to re-emit, to absorb and re-emit that heat. Now, this is the natural greenhouse gas effect. And the main greenhouse gases are CO2, the carbon dioxide, and water vapor. And if it was not because of this natural greenhouse effect, today, every day, we will have 10 or 15 degrees colder temperatures than we have. Actually, the natural greenhouse effect is what allows life in the planet. But what has happened in the last several hundred years is that the activity of the humans in the planet have resulted in large, very large emissions of greenhouse gases. And so now we have the same effect as in a greenhouse having a thicker roof, a thicker glass in the roof. So now more heat is trapped in the system that affects the hydrological cycle in the Earth, and that in turn affects the climate in the whole planet. And this is what is important of climate change. Now, that climate change, when we understand climate change like that, it's very clear that the main action needed here is to work in the causes, is to reduce the greenhouse gases, is to reduce the emission of gases that are creating this enhanced greenhouse effect, which, as you know, in the language of climate change community, the reduction of emissions, the net reduction of emissions is called mitigation. And how can you reduce the net emissions of greenhouse gases? You can either reduce the greenhouse gas emissions or you can remove some carbon from the atmosphere. And how do you do that? We know to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the main activities are related to renewable energy, to a good management of residues. And how do you remove carbon from the atmosphere? You can do it with good agricultural practices, you can do it with some engineering approaches, and you can do it also with reforestation, afforestation. So this is, when thinking about climate change, it makes sense that we try to attack the causes, reduce the net emissions of greenhouse gases. The problem is that because of the huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions of the past, even if the world stopped today, even if there was zero greenhouse gas emissions starting today, the inertia of the current of the past emissions will result in changes in climate for several decades. But we know that the world will not stop emitting greenhouse gases. Hopefully, it will reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, but it will not stop. So climate, we know for sure that climate will continue to change for several decades, and therefore we need to adapt. When we think of how to approach the challenges of food security or food systems and connecting it to climate change, that means we need to adapt to a changing climate. And our institution works quite a lot with organizations like the World Food Program or the FAO of the United Nations, with national governments. And when we work with them and in issues like food security, the first question that we get asked is, what do we need to adapt to? What will future climate look like? And the best tools that science has today to answer that question is the climate models. So what are climate models? They take the planet, they divide the planet into small grids, and then they take, for each grid, several layers up into the atmosphere, several layers down into the oceans, and then they simulate exchanges of heat, of energy, following known rules, scientific principles and rules. And by doing that, they simulate the circulation of the atmosphere in the whole planet. Actually, these models are very similar to the models that I use for the weather forecasts. Weather forecast that you see in TV, it's going to rain tomorrow, it's going to be hot. The difference is that the climate science community modified those models to allow models to change the chemical composition of the atmospheric component of the model. So they can simulate different concentrations of greenhouse gases. Then they run the model and they can get an idea of what the future climate will look like. Now, like anything in science, this is knowledge that is being generated. There's a lot of progress. Models are getting better and better, but there's still some limitations. There's some things that we still don't understand. There's still some things that the models don't solve well. For example, one is in the area where I am today, in South America. And one question that we asked is, if you take the best 50 models today, the best 50 climate models in the world available to the scientific community, how do those models see what happened in the past? This is not projections of the future. This is actual. How did the models see the changes in precipitation in the summertime of the Southern Hemisphere, in the warmer months? How are the models seeing the history of precipitation? And so 0 means no change. Up means wetter. Here, negative values means drier. And basically what the models are seeing is that in the last 100 years or more, the summer rainfall increased. About from a little bit 1 millimeter per month to about 5 or 6 millimeters per month, which is quite significant. So this is how the models see what happened in the history. Now, what happened in reality in that window of Southeast South America? This is what happened. So now the black line is what is the observed changes in precipitation during the 21st century. Huge. It's one of the areas in the world that increased the most the precipitation in the summer months. None of the models was even close, not to predict, to explain what happened in the past. So does this mean that the models are useless? No. In other places of the world, the models work better. But what this means is, like anything in science, this is progress. This is knowledge in progress. We are understanding better and better how these models can be improved, but there's still a lot of limitations. So if there are limitations to explain the history, there is also limitations to propose what the climate will look like in the future. So that's one of the problems or the challenges of establishing future climate change scenarios. Another problem, which I think is even worse, more difficult to work, is that in order to use those models, we have to estimate the chemical composition of the atmosphere in the future. We have to make assumptions for the next 80 or 100 years of what technologies we'll be using, how much energy will be renewable, what will be the deforestation rates, what will be the population. So a lot of uncertainty in the information for the future. Imagine how difficult it is to make assumptions of how the world will evolve in the next 80 years. It's very difficult. So what the scientific community did was to propose scenarios. So they propose socioeconomic scenarios that are very optimistic, and so show that in the next 100 years, 80 years, the emissions of greenhouse gases will be low, or scenarios that are very pessimistic. The emissions of greenhouse gases will be very high. And now they have those emissions of greenhouse gases connected to possible development pathways. They connect that with the climate models and they elaborate the scenarios of the future climate. And this is the results that are very typically found in the IPCC reports. IPCC, as you know, is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change that congregates the scientific community, the climate science community of the world. And so what are the scenarios for the future saying about the temperature in a very big window? I don't know if you can see the map, but a very big window in South America that includes basically all of Argentina, all of Europe, Paraguay, part of Bolivia, a big part of Brazil. So it's a very big window. And the question is, what are the models saying that will happen with temperature in the next 80 years? And this is what they're saying. So you have in gray, the observed temperatures in that big window. And then in blue, the projected temperature for the future, if you are optimistic, for the optimistic scenarios, and in red, the pessimistic scenarios. So basically what it's saying is, depending on the development pathways, the temperature by the end of the 21st century will be anywhere between 1 degree warmer than today or 7 degree warmer than today. Now, this is huge. That's a huge rate. This is equivalent if you were interested, for example, in a study that you need to project the price of soybeans. And soybean today, the price of 1 ton of soybean is about $340. This is equivalent to say, by the end of the century, the price of 1 ton of soybean, that today is $340, it will be between $50 and $2,000. So it's it's very difficult to make any studies, any projections, any plans, with that type of huge uncertainty, huge range. And this is for this big window. Most policy makers are not interested in big windows. They're interested in maybe a state in Brazil, sometimes even smaller areas than that. If you try to make these projections for those smaller areas, the uncertainties are much, much bigger. Now, this is for temperature. At least the sign of the change is clear. All the models say the temperature will increase. What happens with precipitation is much worse. With precipitation, we don't even have a trend. With precipitation, again, this is observed and this is projected. And what you see maybe is increased variability. You see more red peaks in the future. And again, this is for the big window, for the scale that a policymaker interested in food security requires, the uncertainty is much, much bigger. So in conclusion, using the best available tools, which are the climate models, the climate change scenarios for the next 80 years, they're very uncertain. And in fact, the objective of IPCC, of the science community, when they developed these climate change scenarios, was not to connect to agricultural models or to health models. No, it was to raise awareness. People must understand that if we don't change the way that our development efforts, we can affect the climate in a very serious way. However, you go to the literature, you go to the scientific literature today, you go to very prestigious journals, and you will find results like this. You will find results that show how Northern Africa will, by 2080, will have corn yields that are 20% lower than today. And if you go, that you can probably find results at the county level, not just the country, the county, the province. And so when you see this, the first question that now that you know where this is coming from, the first question is, where is the uncertainty? Where is the uncertainty in these results showing that, I don't know, Northern Africa, Northern Ethiopia will have a 25% decrease in corn yields? No uncertainty. Now, this not only is this scientifically wrong, this is dangerous, because a policymaker understands this type of information a lot easier than complicated information that has uncertainty, that is difficult to explain, it's not very clear what is the development pathway. So because this is a lot easier to understand, then a lot of bad decisions can be taken. In fact, in our experience, the reality is that most policymakers are not very interested in what will happen in 2080. But if you see how much money has been spent in developing these type of scenarios, it's many millions of dollars. So clearly we need a different approach. And that different approach, first of all, we cannot think of climate change as a problem of the future, a problem that for 2070 and 2080. No, it's a problem of today. Climate has been already changing. It will continue to change. But it's a problem of the present. It's not a problem of the future. Second thing, and this is where all the scientific evidence coincide, is that one of the most damaging impacts of a changing climate is not a slow change in the mean values. It's an increase in the year-to-year variability. That means increased year-to-year variability means more frequent and more damaging droughts, more frequent and more damaging storms, heat waves. Now, those extreme events, those damaging events, are the same events that we are suffering today. And so a very smart way to start improving adaptive capacity of societies, trying to find resilient food systems, is by starting to improve adaptation to the climate of today. I was telling you, when we interact with international organizations, with national governments, and they ask for help to improve adaptive capacity to the future climate, our first question is, do you consider that your system, your society is well adapted to current climate? When there is a drought, you have a system that works very well. When there's storms, you have a system that works well. The richest country in the world, one of the richest cities in the world, New York City. Look what happened with Sandy. So we are not well prepared to confront variability of today. Let's work on that with the additional advantage that a policy maker, a decision maker, a member of the government, a person working in FAO, in the World Bank, is a lot more interested in actions that we do today, not in actions that we think we should do because in 2080, this is what may happen with climate. No, today, what do we do to increase resilience? What do we do to have a more resilient food system? And so what do we do today? What do we do to improve adaptation to current climate? we can do interventions in technologies, for example, in food systems, diversify production. Wherever is feasible, introduce irrigation to reduce this variability of productivity, improve crops with genetics, reduce uncertainties. One of the worst consequences, one of the worst impacts of this pandemic that we are going through now is the uncertainty. It's not knowing when this is going to end, not knowing what is the chances of going down or going up. It's a complete uncertain situation. So anything that we can do to reduce that uncertainty with better information from the past, learning from the past, what worked in the past, the best possible monitoring system of what is happening today for early warnings, early action, early response, and the best information we can provide for the future. But not for the future 40 years, for the future, for the next 3 months. What can we say for the next 3 months? How can we improve decision for the next 3 months? And then we can have very good technologies to reduce vulnerability, to increase resilience. We can have the best possible information of the past, of the present, and of the future. Still, we're going to get hit by droughts. Still, storms are going to impact our societies, production system, food system. So there are risks that we cannot manage. We cannot manage with technology, we cannot manage with information. That risk we have to transfer. How do we transfer? With financial tools like insurance. And we will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, an example of reducing uncertainties related to climate information. One very useful tool is what's called the seasonal climate forecast. Seasonal climate forecasts give us information of what we can expect with climate for the next 3 months. So we are planning, if we have an early warning systems indicating that there is a high chance of low food production in a given place in the world, we can take action. We can take early action. We can be prepared. We can improve preparedness of the farmers community, of the government, of the aid organizations. So very important to have information of what you can expect in the next season. Now, how do this work? Think about it. For the next 3 months, this is the latest climate forecast issued by the institution where I work. For the next 3 months, November, December, January, what can happen with rainfall? It can happen one of 3 things. Rainfall in the next 3 months can be above normal, can be below normal, or can be around normal. And when we know nothing of what we can expect of the next 3 months, all of this, each one of these scenarios have the same chance, right? 33, 33, and 33. And this is what is shown in these maps with the white colors. White colors mean we really have nothing to help us to imagine what will happen in the next 3 months. But as you see in the map, there are some areas with colors. So in northern South America, there are blue and green colors. And in the area where I am today, in Southeast South America, South Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Central Argentina, there are these brownish colors. So what do they mean? They mean, for example, in Southeast South America, for the coming 3 months, instead of 33% chances of rainfall being below normal, the map is saying the chances of below normal rainfall are almost double, 60% instead of 33. And in Colombia, in Panama, in Costa Rica, is saying in the next 3 months, the chances of getting rainfall above normal instead of 33 is 70%. So it's giving an idea, quantitative idea, probabilities of what type of season you can expect. Or what is the probability of the rainfall in the next season, in the next 3 months, to be higher or lower than normal. And the truth is that when we work with users of different communities and we explain this, they get pretty disillusioned. They say, this is all you can say. You get all these computers, all these scientists with the best science, and what you provide is this type of information. And it looks like not much, but let me show you one thing that may change that way of thinking. This is the long-term monthly rainfall average for one place in Guatemala. And what it shows is this is January, February, March, April, shows a very neat rainfall precipitation curve with the wet season, with a dry season here and here. This is a long-term monthly rainfall average. Now, what happens if you pick randomly 10 years of that location and you plot the monthly rainfall of that location in those randomly selected 10 years? You get this. So now, here in black is the long-term rainfall, monthly average, and then each color is a different year. Try to find one year that behaves similar to the average year. There's none. In fact, the probability of getting an average year is 0. But think, how many decisions are based on an average year? How many farmers say, I'm going to plant my crop in this month because on average, that's when the rain starts. Or I'm going to do this activity because on average, this is what I expect. So we are making decisions, we are planning activities based on something that has a probability of 0. Can we plan based on something that has a probability larger than 0? That's the role of the seasonal climate forecast. So the only thing that I will add to this, again, I'll be glad to answer all the questions you may have at the end. But now, instead of working only in these 3 months periods, the scientists are looking at shorter periods, for example, weeks to 1 or 2 months. And they're looking also not just at total rainfall, but what is the probability that in the next 3 months, what is the likelihood of having big storms or having extended dry periods? So this is one way to reduce uncertainty. Now it's not that we have no idea what will happen in the next 3 months. Now we have an idea. We can have an idea. And this is important not only in the food systems of my country, the country where we are working, it's also very important for countries that are very dependent on food trade. Senegal, for example, 60% of the food is imported. A lot comes from Europe and a lot comes from South America. So here for Senegal, what happens with climate shocks in the main producing areas where they get their food is very important. It can affect the prices, the accessibility. And then inside of the food system in Senegal, of course, the impacts of climate can affect the local markets and also affect access and price level. And then we gave examples of how to reduce uncertainties with good information. And we said that some of the risks, there's a part of the risk that we cannot manage. For that, we need to transfer, we need financial tools. But the tools have to be accessible. So what is a typical financial tool to transfer risk is insurance. But insurance is very, very expensive in agriculture. So we need a different type of insurance. How are we working with this in the food systems that we are working in agriculture production systems? We start from what we can expect for any climate related output. This can be food production in a region of the country where we are working, can be crop yields. And what happens, of course, is there are a few years where the situation is a complete disaster. The bad weather and bad prices, for example. There are times where the situation is wonderful. You have great weather, very favorable, a lot of food production. And then you have a majority of the yields of the years when the production is normal, the food is okay. And so we can divide that risk into sections. We can call this the more critical left side of the curve, we can call a crisis. Then, for example, what happened in New York with Sandy. Then you have the hardship, for example, what happens in a country when you have a drought. And what happens in the food production, in the agricultural systems, especially in the most fragile, vulnerable systems, is that people are so worried about this type of years. And they're worried for a good reason. They are worried because they can lose their farm, they can lose their land. Those are years where they cannot send the kids to school. So because they're so worried about those years, what they do is they design their production systems in a very inexpensive way. They don't use fertilizers, they use inexpensive seeds. So that if they have to confront an unfavorable year, they will not get into the debt. They will not have to be in a very dangerous situation that they will end having to sell their land. But look what happens. Because they design the production systems in order to avoid big losses, they miss all the opportunities connected to normal or better years. Now it's understandable. It's understandable. If I have the chance, the risk of losing my land, of not sending my kids to school, of course I will use very inexpensive production systems. But then you get into these poverty traps, because risk aversion reduces the adoption of technologies that every farmer knows. They know that their production will be better with the right fertilizers, with the right seeds. But risk aversion reduces the adoption of technology. That in turn affects natural resources, for example, soil degradation, nutrient mining, and that results in poverty traps and food insecurity situations. So what we need to do is cover the farmers for these situations so that they can take advantage for the normal and better situations. That's what the index insurance does. The index insurance, and I can explain more if you want at the end of the presentation, the index insurance is not designed like the traditional insurance to compensate for damage. The index insurance is designed to let the farmers invest in the technologies that they know they should be investing and sleep in peace. So, in summary, connecting climate change and food security. Global warming, climate change is caused by the emissions of greenhouse gases, including emissions in the food systems. So food systems they suffer because of climate changes in climate, but they're also responsible for the emissions of greenhouse gases. So key in combating, in improving the situation related to climate change is reducing net emissions of greenhouse gases, or mitigation in the climate change language. But climate will continue to change. Hopefully emissions will start to go down, but still climate will continue to change for several decades. And therefore, everything that we do related to food system, to development effort, they have to factor in adaptation, capacity to improve the adaptive capacity to a changing climate. Now, it's very difficult to know what the future climate will look like. You know, I know that you have been seeing probably a lot of maps showing how malaria will increase here and how corn yield will be reduced here. But the truth, I hope you understand from what I showed you before, that the uncertainty level of those projections is huge. And what we know for sure is that the year-to-year variability will increase, which means more frequent and more intense extreme events like droughts, floods, and heat waves. So How can we improve adaptation to future climate? Start by improving the adaptive capacity to current climate. What can we do today? What technologies? How can I improve information to reduce uncertainties? What type of insurance policy can I establish that is accessible to farmers and allow farmers to adopt technology? There's only one more thing that I would like to discuss with you. I'm looking at the time and I want to leave time for your questions. And I think it's important, it's very important for me being in a university. And what we do, what we have been discussing until now is what is the right climate information or climate related information for more resilient food system, for better development efforts. The reality is that this is very useful, but this is not how we inform decisions. We don't inform decisions with one dimension, just with climate. We don't inform policies with just climate. We need integrated information of things like climate, prices, characteristics of a farming community, policies that are already in place, what is a cultural, personal preference, human behavior, many other factors. That if we really want to inform policies for resilient food systems, we need information not just on climate, we need to connect this information. Now, one of the things that have been bugging me for a long time in my work is there is a huge amount of knowledge being generated in places like Cornell, like Columbia University, research organizations all over the world that are wonderful. And still the proportion of that amazing knowledge that is used to inform policy is relatively low. And why is that? I think part of that is the cultural differences. What is the culture in our scientific research community compared to the decision-making community? Decision makers, if you're a farmer, or if you're a minister of agriculture, or if you're a manager of a World Bank, they approach problems holistically. Then they're not thinking just if what is expected with the climate, what is expected with the prices. They're thinking about the whole situation, the whole system. And very often they approach decisions intuitively. Now, how do we approach our work in the scientific community, in the academic organizations, in the research institutions? Exactly the opposite. We have this reductionist approach. We're becoming better and better in smaller and smaller things. We're specialists. We are creating what we call in an old paper, we create islands of knowledge. We know a lot about the soil properties of this type of clay and potassium. So we create these beautiful islands where we have a lot of knowledge, but in a sea of ignorance. We don't connect those islands. And if we want to inform policy, we need to integrate the knowledge. And this is where, again, I am especially interested in this area, because if you think, most of our academic organizations do not promote the education of people that are able to integrate knowledge. Most of our universities, they promote the specialization. They promote being very, very good at climate models for the tropics. And in fact, when you see people that are interested in integrated knowledge in the typical classical academic environment, they're not promoted. And so this is something that if we really want the science to inform policy, inform decisions, we need to promote more of this type of persons, persons that are able to integrate climate and economics and sociology and human behavior and culture and understand the climate implications for the food system. And they integrate that knowledge, they translate it into a language that is understandable and usable and actionable for a policymaker, and they transfer that knowledge. That's one thing that I believe that we need to promote more and more, is programs that allow students to be educated as knowledge integrators. Of course, there are also tools like decision support systems, in which very modern tools where you have all types of information of climate, of corn, of crop yields and diseases and soil and prices, and you use simulation models, and they allow, for example, a farmer advisor, an extension agent, to work in questions. What would happen? Questions like, what would happen if we have a La Niña year? What happens if I implement a new technology? What happens if the price of the crop that I'm growing changes? What happens if insurance is available? And you can start interacting and working with decision makers, farmers, ministers, agents of a development organization. You can work with quantitative assessment using these tools and informing decisions, integrating, translating into something actionable. So to finish, and one more time, if we really want to inform policy, development, resilient food systems with scientific information on climate, how do we improve adaptation? Start by improving adaptation to current climate. What can I do today to improve the resilience of the food systems, as opposed to trying to guess the climate of the next 100 years? And two, if we really want to inform policy, decisions, development plans, food security, we need to integrate and translate the information that we are generating in the research and academic organizations. For that, there's some great tools like decision support systems that integrate all this knowledge. And we need to promote the education of people that are integrated of this knowledge and that can translate that knowledge into something that is understandable and actionable for policymakers and decision makers in general. Okay, so this is what I had to share with you. I know it's a little bit late. You must be tired and probably have an excess of Zooms, but I'm more than happy to answer questions if you have.
I want to thank you so very, very much. A virtual clap to you for sure, for a really sobering intellectual conversation about a topic. And the points you raise are so intuitive. I mean, in medicine, for example, we tend to be very focused on what we do, subspecialties and so forth. I do a lot of work in rural India. So we go in, we get people in the hospital, we clean them up, we make them all better, but we send them right back to the same environment that got them sick in the first place. So you need to integrate, various disciplines, which is, I think, what you were saying very loud and clear in your presentation today. And thank you. I want to open up the chat for those that have questions to ask, and we can certainly stay on a little bit to do that. So while you're thinking of questions to ask, as the moderator, I'll use my chair to ask a question about over-fertilization, which then degrades the soil. How do we stop that activity from happening before we actually have soil that's not going to be useful for anything?
Yeah, so that is a problem mainly in the developed countries. In most developing countries, the problem is that the fertilizer use is not connected to good soil testing, plant analysis. It's just, in many countries, the most of the crops are under fertilized. They're just badly fertilized, but they're under fertilized. In Europe, in the US, in Canada, there are many places where, or in commercial agriculture of this area, in South America, there are areas where over-fertilization can be a problem. The best, I think the best solution for that problem is just good science. There are very good soil testing methods for determining the nutrient needs of crops in the world, and it's just following rules. That's something that I think, you made me remember my dissertation was on that. It was in the Chesapeake Bay. I had some of the best seafood thanks to my dissertation, because what we were trying to do is avoid the nitrogen contamination of the Chesapeake Bay due to over-fertilization of corn. And so, the solution was that. The solution was, what is the best method to have a soil testing and plant analysis strategy to develop good recommendations? And it worked.
At least there was some benefit. You got your PhD and really had very good seafood and hopefully came up with some good policy. I think we have a question from my colleague, Dr. Scalea. Can you see it or shall I read it?
Yeah. So how should educators encourage broader education to create more integrators? So I can tell you what we are trying to do in Colombia. In Colombia, the Earth Institute was created, I think, with that purpose. It was created to try to tackle world problems and challenges. And so, in the Earth Institute now, they have like probably 30 institutes, part of the Earth Institute. But in reality, what happened was that integration didn't work very well. Each center continued doing very specialized work in their area of expertise. And if you think about it, the whole university system is built normally to your career improves if you publish more work in a very specialized journal. And I've seen this, I witnessed this with young people that were trying to integrate agriculture with climate, and they were trying to publish work, and the journal in agriculture would say, this is not agriculture, this is climate. And then they would try to publish in the climate journal, and say, this is not climate, this is agriculture. And so now, more recently, there's several journals, good journals, that are now a journal for sustainable practices, journal for informing policies, and now there are more and more places where students can publish, and which is great. I still think that we need slowly to change the culture in our organizations. We need to really value people that are able to connect what we do in the specialized centers with the people that are taking action, the people that are really making decisions and affecting millions and millions of people. And so yes, in many areas, that is a work that consultants do. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we have in the universities and in the research organizations, if we have people that were talking to both ends, to the people that are generating the knowledge, understanding the needs in the development efforts, connecting those things, and then understanding how to integrate all this knowledge and making it useful for policy. I think that, in the universities and in the research institutions, the pressure that we are feeling to produce more socioeconomically relevant results has been increasing in the last decade or so. And that is good. I mean, in order to advance, we need the very specialized scientists, but we also need the integrators. So I'm sorry, my answers are too long. Let's see, here's another. Does the additional CO2 in the atmosphere reduce the amount of solar energy? Sorry, I can read here.
I can read it for you if you wish.
Oh no, I should wear my glasses.
Ah, okay.
So, oh, I lost it. Does the CO2 in the atmosphere reduce the amount of solar energy that gets to Earth's surface using it? Oh, okay. So the question is the CO2 in the atmosphere reducing the amount of solar energy that reaches the Earth's surface? No. I mean, yes, the solar energy is filtered once that it goes through the atmosphere, but what is relevant for the global warming and for the climate change, and for the climate change is not that the image that I gave of a thicker glass works for the heat that is trapped, but not for the solar radiation that is incoming. It's a good question. I never thought of this. And I need to be sure that I clarify that. It's a great question. I never, it can be misleading. So yeah, so when you have a thicker glass, you have to imagine that the amount of solar radiation doesn't change, but what it changes is the amount of heat that becomes trapped. So,
It's a good question that I think does not lend itself to a quick answer. But thank you, Tarsila, for that.
hold on, I'm Keith.
Oh, no, it wasn't Tarsila. So we're now to Tarsila. Yeah. By the way, let me just interject that it is at 6. So for those who do have to leave, we thank you so much for joining us. And for those who can stay, please, we will continue.
Okay, Tarsila.
So this is about Brazil.
Uh-huh.
And that could probably take a whole lecture talking about the politics of.
Yeah, well, you're not alone, Tarsila. In the States, we're facing something that is pretty difficult too. And so, yeah, in the case of, I really don't know what to say. I mean, I'm trying to be optimistic. I'm hoping for a better outcome in the next elections in the US, and hopefully something similar will happen in Brazil. But that's all I can say. I understand your feelings. I have the same type of feeling. But yeah, I think the best thing we can do is vote. That's strong democracy and hope.
Leonardo has a question about methane and cattle.
Yeah, so methane, yeah. There's a big discussion, with the cattle breeding and the what happened with the methane is that the ruminant is amazing ability that you give them as food. You give them basically cellulose. It's like almost like if you're giving a piece of wood, and they have one stomach where they have bacteria that are able to digest these very difficult to digest fibers, and they convert that into protein, into carbohydrates. And so it's amazing that they have this ability. But when they do that bacteria that are in the stomach produces methane. And the problem with methane is that the greenhouse is a greenhouse gas that has a ability to warm the earth that is 20 times larger than the CO2. The good thing is that the life cycle is smaller. It's only present for about 10 years. But in those 10 years, the global, the warming capacity of that methane is 20 times worse. And so, yeah, the ruminants are often viewed as the bad guys in the climate change. I think we have to be careful, though. I think we have to be careful with not being too harsh in the livestock producing system, because the reality is that, you know, the carbon footprint, right? So the amount of carbon that is emitted, CO2 emitted equivalent to produce 1 kilo of meat, of beef, for example, varies a lot. If you are in the Amazon, right, and this is something probably that Tarsila is thinking, but if you are in the Amazon, the process is you have a beautiful tropical forest. You go there, you with a caterpillar, right? You destroy that, you burn it, the tropical forest. Then you go and then you plant a pasture, and then you produce beef. The carbon footprint of that system is huge. Now, if you are in the Pampas, in southern Brazil, in Uruguay, in parts of Argentina, where you have grasslands that have always been grasslands. Grasslands in the Pampas are there, have been there forever. The carbon footprint in those production systems is completely different. And if you compare those two with you know, the livestock production in Senegal or in Ethiopia, it's also completely different. So the best thing is to put some science behind that and do good measurements of what is the carbon footprint, carbon balance of different production systems. What I think is wrong, and I don't think it helps, is to say things like beef production contaminates, or beef, because what beef production? Beef production in the Amazon, beef production by the people in Kenya, beef production in the Pampas of Rio Grande do Sul. The important thing is to say, is to measure this carbon footprint. Okay, and then we have MJ Wilson. Oh.
Oh.
Oh, so this is irrigation.
Which, by the way, is the subject of the next lecture in the series, water. Yeah.
Oh, water management. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've seen some very good systems, and of course, it's similar to what I was saying to what I was discussing about the beef production. You know, if you're in Morocco, or if you are in Nordeste, Brazil, where you have very little rainfall, you know, we have to be very careful with the water use efficiency, with the, you know, water depletion. If you're in a place like Uruguay, where you have, you know, basically 80% of the water that falls as rainfall ends in the ocean, then, you know, you can probably design irrigation systems that can be, you know, effective, efficient, and safe. I'm very happy to see the evolution. For example, I don't know if you have seen some examples of drip irrigation in extensive crops. I was surprised. I didn't know. To me, drip irrigation was for horticulture and for vegetables and fruits, but no. I mean, they have amazing systems that are very efficient in the water use. With drip irrigation, Israel has an amazing technology for irrigation that are very sustainable. So again, I think that I've seen of terrible things done with irrigation, terrible. But I also think I'm also happy to know that there's some efforts that are very good, and sustainable and effective and efficient. Okay.
And I think this is, I think, the last question.
Okay. What about creating new plants which need less water? Yeah. So yeah, I just saw today, actually today, I met with a researcher that is doing exactly that. She's using CRISPR, that editing, genome editing, and looking at, she found a gene that makes crops more. Oh, you were about higher temperature, but it's the same thing. This was more drought tolerant.
Mhm.
But for example, I know that in the Philippines, they one of the CG centers created a rice variety, a rice cultivar that is very tolerant to high heat. So yeah, and this is the other thing that I forgot to say, and is that again, many of these climate change, traditional climate change studies, they seem to use the assumptions that technologies will not change, that plant breeding will not be able to catch up with some of these changes. And I think that, of course, first of all, sometimes I worry that my message is not clear. Climate change is a terrible threat. It's one of the worst threats that humanity is facing. And we have to be sure that we reduce it, minimize it to the maximum possible. But as I was showing to you, even if we stopped, climate will continue to change for decades. And so we need to adapt. Now, there's a lot of things that we can do in technology, including plant breeding, including feasible irrigation systems, including financial instruments that can transfer some of the risks. So I think that the main thing is go to the causes, combat climate change, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But there's a lot of things that we can do to help, especially to help the more vulnerable production systems with technologies, with information, and with financial tools.
Which we're doing, of course, with disease-resistant, strains of wheat, of rice, of soybeans, and so forth.
Yeah.
As you say, with technology, we can try to at least make sure that the food production is able to sustain what other insults
Yeah.
as humans bring upon the earth. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so very, very much for your time, for your wonderful lecture. And I want to thank those who joined us and asked great questions. This was really extremely educational, edifying, maybe a little scary, but it gives us, something that we need to collectively, as the human race, work towards. Otherwise, clearly, we will not have enough food to sustain the population.
Yeah.
Thank